Kaimere is a distant planet. It is defined by waves of life brought from Earth and set free to evolve independently in this new context. The indigenous life of the planet, swarms of microbes called magic by the people who live there, are what harvest Earth organisms and make copies on Kaimere. As the asteroid which concluded the Mesozoic never struck Kaimere, dinosaurs remain the dominant terrestrial megafauna. There are two lineages of archosaur alive today, Pseudosuchia and Avametartarsalia. Pseudosuchia are the archosaurs closest to crocodiles, like the caiman, alligators, and gharials, while Avametartarsalia are archosaurs closer related to birds, like birds. These clades are often simplified as birdline and croc-line archosaurs. Birdline archosaurs include the ornithodyrans, or other birds, and the pterosaurs, along with a few other tentative basal taxa outside of these two groups. Birdline archosaurs, specifically non-avian dinosaurs, have gotten a lot of discussion in their roles within Kaimere's ecology. Birds themselves still have a lot to be covered, but today we're here to discuss the croc-line archosaurs, the Pseudosuchia, and their natural history in Kaimere. While stem archosaurs may have been present in some capacity in the Permian, the origin of the clade and its major lineages begin at the earliest Triassic. Kaimere was at the height of the Permian dynasty throughout this era, so unfortunately a lot of the early radiations of Pseudosuchians, such as the herbivorous shuvosaurs and aetosaurs, the bipedal poposaurs, and apex predatory Rauisuchians, were never harvested. The first Pseudosuchians taken by Kaimere's portal were generally more familiar clades, the Neosuchians. Pseudosuchia means false crocodiles. The term was originally given to a number of Triassic croc-line archosaurs to distinguish them from the ancestors of modern crocs and gators. Further analysis of the clades by Dr. Sterling Nesbitt supported Pseudosuchia as originally defined to include the Neosuchians. Later studies bolstered Dr. Nesbitt's findings. As the name Pseudosuchia was in place first, it retained priority. That crocodiles belong to the false crocodile clade is one of those delightful quirks of our naming conventions. Not that important, perhaps, just some fun natural history trivia. The Assembly has a difficult time reliably dating harvest events, specifically beyond a few million years ago. All the way back in the earliest Jurassic, around 200 million years ago, both croc and birdline archosaurs were introduced to Kaimere. Not only was the planet recovering from a mass extinction, most of the archosaurs were already large and quite derived. Their spread and dominion was quick, in many niches was absolute. Croc-line archosaurs have been devastated following the end Triassic extinction on Earth, with Crocodilomorpha being the only major clade in this line confirmed to be harvested and introduced to Kaimere. While exact dates aren't known, there are strata with a striking divide between therapsid and archosaur distinctions on either side of the dynastic borders. An animal similar to Protosuchus is very common find in the Nikari sites, which appear to show this boundary. While theropods like Dilophosaurus increased their dimensions and went on to become apex predator in many environments, a clade of basal Protosuchians grew quite massive in their own right, in many ways converging with the Rauisuchians of Earth's Triassic. This was a time when these early crocodilomorphs experimented with a wide range of niches, not just giant predators. Some became herbivores, some bipedal, some aquatic, and even pelagic. This era was in many ways the heyday of crocodilomorphs in Kaimere. The first Jurassic dynasty had many dinosaurs, but protosuchid crocodilomorphs make up as much as half of the megafauna in some formations, especially in Nikar. Arvel was still connected to the southern continents, and archosaurs would not be able to establish themselves as a staple in their megafauna until the Cretaceous dynasties. Despite this great diversity of protosuchids, some Pseudosuchians at the time assumed the same body plan, lifestyle, and appearance as many crocs from a few independent lineages. This niche, the ambush predator in the waterways, was largely open to them. The prior dynasty had sparse waterways toward its end, and the prelude of the first Jurassic dynasty was one of rapid forestation and a humid climate. This sudden influx of freshwater habitats not only without native therapsids and other clades presenting competition, but it seems Pseudosuchians rapidly became dominant in this niche throughout Nikar and western Hyrule at the very least. The second Jurassic dynasty saw a trend toward a more arid and cooler planet. Dinosaurs boasted of the first Jurassic dynasty and newly introduced taxa from several Cameroonian and Tithonian harvests outcompeted most of the Protosuchids. The herbivorous Protosuchids were the breakout survivors and held on especially in a few closed forests, as the open forests and floodplains became the dominion of sauropods, as they would remain to this day. The late Jurassic dynasty has some Pseudosuchians introduced through harvests, though the most successful of these were the clades comfortable in the water. Throughout the Mesozoic of Earth, many clades of terrestrial and marine Pseudosuchians arose. The Thalattosuchians, which the Metrionychids being the most specialized form, became fully marine with such adaptations as fluked tails and live birth, thus far unique among archosaurs. Metriorhynchids were introduced to Kaimere during the early years of the second Jurassic dynasty. This was as the oceans were recovering from poor health during the first Jurassic dynasty, and it seems the Metrionychid arrival was just in time for an adaptive radiation. While there were plesiosaurs, ichthyosaurs, and aquatic therapsids in various niches, for reasons unknown, the Metriorhynchids experienced a diversity of size and niche they had not experienced on Earth. One group developed specialized crushing teeth, and some appear to have specialized in the abundant trilobites and crustaceans. Another had a high-vaulted palate assumed to aid in section feeding of cephalopods like ammonites, and the top predators of the time were the 13-meter Metrionychids from the second Jurassic dynasty. Terrestrial Pseudosuchians never regained the ground they had lost at the end of the first Jurassic dynasty, but the Mesozoic dynasties were hardly unkind to them. A wide variety of Notosuchians were harvested, with their prime being in the second Cretaceous dynasty, as several Gondwanan harvests produced a plethora of terrestrial crocs, which have become especially common and successful in southern Nikar, though they don't appear to have been dominant predators or defining herbivores in the mainland, at the very least. The second Cretaceous dynasty may have been a golden age on land, but it saw a general decline in ocean health and productivity. Metrionychids lost a lot of their species diversity during this era, with the arrival of giant mosasaur toward its end seeming to be their undoing. Recent discoveries in the oceans, generally isolated within Hyrule, have proved a sanctuary for this clade, and it seems that they recovered before mosasaurs arrived, but they are at a shadow of their former might during the Mesozoic dynasties. It was during the second Cretaceous dynasty that the first of our modern croc clades were harvested. While some people look at crocodiles and alligators and assume a close relationship, perhaps as lions are to tigers, the reality is perhaps a surprisingly distant relationship. The earliest alligator line Eusuchians are around 80 million years old, meaning the common ancestor of gators and crocs was at least that ancient, possibly more so. However, this is not a situation like sloths, wherein the 2- and 3-toed sloths have a common ancestor as far back as 40 million years ago, yet independently converged on the same body plan and lifestyle from terrestrial ancestors. The ancestor of crocs and gators probably wouldn't stand out in a lineup of modern Eusuchians. The general body plan of crocodiles and gators isn't the ancestral condition of the clade, nor is it one crocs were restricted to. Indeed, the Mechosuchians are closer to crocodiles than alligators, yet many became terrestrial and even possibly arboreal on Earth. It may not be the ancestral body plan and lifestyle, but there have been lineages all the way back to the Jurassic taxa that thrived as crocodiles and alligators do today. As the saying goes, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Dirosaurids and Allosuchids were a clade of crocodiliforms in Earth's history that were not close relatives of modern clades, but in many ways resembled them. The infamous Sarcosuchus, for example, was an Allosuchid and could easily be mistaken for a large crocodile with an odd snout to all but the most trained eye. A sophisticated secondary palate diagnoses this general clade, to which all modern crocodilians belong. This allows them to breathe through their nostrils entirely independent of their mouth, either eating or if the mouth is underwater, a clearly beneficial adaptation for a semi-aquatic air-breathing predator. Crocodiloid and gavialoid, or crocodile and gavial line Pseudosuchians, may have been harvested, as their respective ancestors have diverged from alligatoroids by this time, though the sparse, non-alligatoroid remains found from this dynasty are difficult to assign to either group, and indeed may belong to Pseudosuchians basal to the divergence of modern Earth clades. Even though their fossils remain scarce, there are many crocodiloid and gavialoid Pseudosuchians in Hyrule which appear to be basal to Cenozoic harvests, so despite lacking much of a fossil record, it can be said with confidence that they were harvested and present. The bear croc and other Pseudosuchians of the Permian Islands are a sister clade to crocodiles, closer to them than to gharials. These had ancestors on the islands which evolved from what are likely resembled modern crocodiles, though they became terrestrial and endothermic by the time of the dynastic extinction, at which point they rapidly grew large. The bear croc is the apex predator of the southern jungles and had a wider range before the spread of dragons 10 million years ago. Other islands throughout Kaimere have a range of secondarily terrestrial Pseudosuchians, with several lineages found in tropical and subtropical islands beyond the known world. The Assembly theorizes this may have happened in Earth's history as well, though the eroding nature of such islands, rarely lasting more than a few dozen million years, means we will likely never find them. The Permian Islands are also home to a variety of herbivorous protosuchians. The sloth croc is the most famous of these. A genus of these sloth crocs with a fluked tail has spread out within the past few million years, with one species arriving in the known world we will hear more about next week. Alligatoroids appear to have evolved in the late Cretaceous North America, and indeed were largely endemic to that continent, with occasional spread to Europe and South America. The Campanian is when many of these alligatoroids were harvested. The transition between the Second Cretaceous Dynasty and the Tyrant Dynasty was extremely arid, and competition for wetlands was quite intense. For reasons unknown, despite a recent harvest, alligatoroids ended up dominating these few remaining niches and outcompeting the few remaining spinosaurs, early semi-aquatic crocodilomorphs, and other contenders for the niche. This transitional period was still warm compared to modern Earth, but cool in the context of Kaimere, and a generally greater tolerance for cold conditions seems to have aided this clade. The largest known Pseudosuchians appear to have evolved during the Tyrant Dynasty. Sobek. Following a general precedent established by the Kurojaku, female Sobek were restricted to under 10 tons so that they could still venture on land to nest. Males, however, shattered all prior records of size, with the largest known fossils being a partial skull found in the mountains north of the Siritic wetlands, estimated to be 3 meters when complete. If accurate, the bulls of Sobek could have reached up to 17 meters in length, though this may represent an extreme upper limit. There would have been in many ways analogous to Kurojaku, carving channels in wetlands with their every movement, being the unquestioned apex predators of the waterways, too large to venture on land, and their migrations to not only deplete local resources, undoubtedly shaped the habitat in staggering ways. Like Kurojaku, the bulls likely traveled far and wide, so while females may have had resident populations, the bulls meant that there was likely only a single species of Sobek across Nikar and Hyrule at a given time. The dynastic extinction was the end of this iconic genus. There simply was insufficient resources to support such behemoths amidst the devastation. Their clade persisted, which we will hear about in 2 weeks, but never again did this lineage of chimeran alligatoroids reach such staggering dimensions. Within the known world, the dynastic extinction appears to have killed most, if not every, Eusouchian genus that was native to the region. The only Pseudosuchians known to have survived were the burrowing herbivores of the protosuchid chelosuchid clade. If there were riverside alligatoroids or other Eusouchians, they did not last long. The genus alligator was harvested from North America and initially had widespread success, but only for a short time before the first South American harvest 13 million years ago. The newly arrived Eusouchians were a related and more speciose clade, then quickly took over. The caimans. Caimans and alligators diverged sometime around the end Cretaceous extinction. While they seem to have evolved in North America, it was the southern continent which saw much greater success. Caiman were quite similar to alligators, and the caiman's stronger armor is perhaps the most notable distinction between the clades. While many caiman species are small, leading to this being their reputation, the black caiman is larger than the American alligator, and just behind the largest crocodile species, such as the Nile and saltwater crocodiles. Caiman thrived throughout the Cenozoic, but the Miocene saw an uptick in their biodiversity. This harvest was prior to the late Miocene crocodilian Golden Age, but it seems the caimans still absolutely thrived. Another clade of crocodilomorph harvested from the mid-Miocene South America were the Sebekids. For a brief window they were vassal predators in the dense jungles of both Arvel and Nikar, but their dominion was declined as titanosaurs remade the forests of the known world to their liking. While dubious fossil teeth suggest Sebekids may have survived on mainland Nikar until early in the anchored period, they were at a fraction of their initial abundance. There was one species that held on to modern times, which we will meet at the end of the month. True crocodiles were first harvested from Asia 12 million years ago, but generally played second fiddle to the established caiman. Gharials also came from Asia, and could avoid competition thanks to targeting different prey. Alligators were brought from North America 8 million years ago, and while they found some success in the south, they were not common. 6 million years ago, an algal bloom brought Armageddon to the Suritic wetlands. While they were abundant wetlands in Arvel and Nikar beyond the known world, the Suritic wetlands are a lush basin spanning roughly the size of the Amazon basin if one includes the northern tributaries. The rivers were choked with algae, and a vast majority of local fauna went extinct. By the time the waterways cleared, a new harvest was triggered to fill the rivers, swamps, and lakes with a plethora of new fauna. This harvest is famous for introducing most of the sloths, which are now among the most successful mammalian megafauna in Kaimere, but lesser known is the fact that it contributed most crocodilians of the known world today. The late Miocene of South America is informally known as the Crocodile Golden Age, as formations of this place and time suggest at least 7 species lived in a given region, whereas today it is rare for more than a few species to live together. This influx of caiman and gharials was not restricted to the Suritic wetlands, and indeed these two lineages went on to dominate most wetlands throughout the anchored period. Other taxa could be found, but most were pushed to the fringes and beyond the known world. 2 of the largest crocodilians in Kaimere today, the giant gharial gen of the Suritic wetlands, and the great caiman of Arvel, both trace their ancestry to this harvest. 1.5 million years ago, the anchored period ended in a sharp change in climate, which rendered the known world a few degrees colder and sea levels reduced. Wetlands in the inland sea were hit hard. Though the climate recovered, many habitats were devastated by its consequences, not the least of which were harvested newcomers. True crocodiles are not only quite aggressive, they can also nest without a bed of wetland vegetation, and this proved extremely advantageous, and they were quite competitive at this time. The wetlands of Arvel and Sarid recovered, and many of the caiman reclaimed lost territory, but the saltwater crocodile had thoroughly outcompeted the saltwater caiman. Both the Saritic wetlands and the Arvelis swamps saw the evolution of a new species of Crocodilis. The saltwater crocodile absolutely thrived as the inland sea recovered, seeing its own range span the Trachayam, Crescent Sea, and the oceans on either side of the known world. This rapid expansion seems to have occurred shortly after their introduction. This was a time of great ecological turnover. The inland sea may have recovered and its sea levels returned to normal, but the faunal turnover was substantial, with a drop in population of desmostylians and giant monitor lizards, extinction of the once dominant saltwater caiman, and the rise in marine sloths and crocodiles. Other fauna that were abundant before, such as the sirenians, sharks, and reef serpent mosasaurs, regained lost ground, so this faunal turnover was hardly unilateral. The context didn't dramatically differ from its prior condition, so the reason for this turnover aren't entirely clear, as there were other crocodiles and several species of marine sloth before. Perhaps the transition simply favored the new guard, and the old failed to reclaim what was lost as things recovered. The next harvest to bring new crocodilians was the North African harvest in the late Pleistocene. The Saritic crocodile, by this time, had spread throughout the Great River, cutting through the Hausa Prairie, and it was into this environment that the Nile crocodile was introduced. While there was undoubtedly some hybridization, the crocodiles of this river system are now almost entirely of African stock. Though their advantages are unknown, the leading theory is that the pre-Hausa riverbanks were more vegetated, and the arid context ended up favoring the newcomer over the established population, which themselves likely outcompeted the prairie caiman by virtue of being more capable of nesting on dry banks. Last, but certainly not least, was the interrupted harvest, which introduced the modern American alligator species. Though these failed to establish a northern range, they became the only crocodilian on the Kadarath Peninsula, and readily hybridized with the Chimeran alligators of the Free States and northern Picardia. Pseudosuchians have a long and proud history on both Earth and Kaimere. Though they have a timeless reputation, and this is deserving of respect, the truth is that their relatives have a far greater range of niche experimentation than we might at first presume. Next week, we will learn about all the species living today throughout the known world. Cheers to Darius and Red Lichen for sponsoring this episode. Technically, they both sponsored Modern Crocs for next week, and for the life of me I thought one of them had sponsored this week's episode. My apologies. I'll say this one's on me and make sure to throw in a few extra crocs next week for their time. I'm sure no one minds some extra crocs. Regardless, next week we'll be covering most species alive in the known world today. You will notice the absence of 3 large taxa, and that's because the 3 biggest species will get their own episode on the 19th. Last episode in this series, we'll cover a special croc found only in the highland jungles of the Eastern Crescent. Thanks to my Patreon patrons for your support, and shout out to Armin Reindl for advice on Pseudosuchian evolution. A lot of the papers I read and studied for this episode and the series as a whole were provided by Armin. He worked on a lot of the prehistoric croc articles you will find on Wikipedia. Definitely recommend you follow if you're interested in learning more about the clade. If you want to know more about prehistoric crocodiles, especially the terrestrial clades, I suggest the 2-part series by Paleoanalysis. Link here. If you want a more comprehensive look at Pseudosuchian taxa and evolution, I suggest this video by Chimerosuchus. We should also collectively bully the skeleton crew to have Alex lead some Pseudosuchian episodes. Hodari Nundu is a paleo artist who has illustrated a lot of Pseudosuchians, giving us some great focal pieces of a clade often relegated to the background. He's got a new YouTube channel you should definitely keep an eye on. Alrighty, I've got to finish up a few last croc illustrations of my own. Thank you all so much for watching, and have a splendid day. Cheers, folks!